Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first ever advocacy podcast co-sponsored by San Jose State University and ALA. Our goal is to simply produce high quality content and have high quality conversations with leaders about library advocacy. This podcast is for librarians and library supporters who wish to learn more about advocacy, as well as decision makers who wish to learn more about why their peers are supporting libraries. Today, we have a power duo of library advocacy, ALA's Megan Murray Cusack, who is ALA's Deputy Director of State Advocacy, and Dr. Alan Inoue, Interim Associate Executive Director of Public Policy and Advocacy, who have both joined us to answer some questions about library advocacy. Welcome, Megan and Alan. And let me just talk briefly about their extensive bios. So Megan is the Deputy Director of State Advocacy in ALA's Public Policy and Advocacy Office. She leads ALA's state and local advocacy efforts in partnership with ALA offices and divisions, state chapters and affiliates, and librarians, library staff, and advocates all across the country. Prior to joining ALA, Megan was a librarian in Chicago Public Schools and the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center. She is also co-founder of the Chicago Teachers Union Librarians Committee, and she has presented and published on topics such as partnerships, library trends, civic engagement, intellectual freedom, and advocacy. And Alan, so Alan Inoue is the Interim Associate Executive Director of Public Policy and Advocacy based in Washington, D.C. He oversees ALA's federal policy and lobbying activities and national initiatives. Previously, he was the coordinator of the President's Information Technology Advisory Committee in the Executive Office of the President of the United States, and also study director at the Computer Science and Telecommunications Board of the National Academy of Sciences. He earned his PhD in Library and Information Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. So welcome, Megan and Alan. I look forward to a conversation.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Okay, so
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. So our first question, can you talk briefly about your journey to your current role with ALA? And Megan, you want to go first?
Sure. My journey is shorter than Alan, so I'll be quick. I have been an ALA member for longer than I have been an ALA staffer. And when I joined ALA staff, I began working with local advocates, people who are on the ground facing an advocacy issue of one sort or another. And that work quickly evolved into working also with our state partners, our member leaders, other ALA offices, and engaging with other organizations who work in the realm of policy and advocacy. So essentially, it has just expanded over time.
Great, thank you. And Alan?
Yeah, thank you. I think like many people in the library field, I have kind of a winding road of a background. I actually started in industry in Silicon Valley. In fact, my first job was as a computer programmer with Atari back in the day.
Atari, yeah.
Yeah.
Space Invaders.
Up the road from you, actually, from San Jose State. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. And then went back to school to Berkeley and got my PhD. And then I thought I was going to become a management consultant, but I ended up in public policy. So I came to Washington and I worked at as you mentioned, the National Academy of Sciences and in the administration before coming to ALA, where I first started in charge of public policy, and then things expanded. And so I also became responsible for government relations and currently also for advocacy and communications.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yes, well, both of you, again, thanks for sharing your broad experiences with us. So the next question really is, and you've kind of touched on it, but where was the pivotal point where you first decided to get involved in library advocacy?
I actually started in education advocacy, and as a community member, as a parent, I have been involved in that work for quite a long time. It was when I went to work for the Chicago Public Schools as a librarian that my attention became more focused on library advocacy and specifically school library advocacy. People are well aware of the challenges that Chicago Public Schools faces. I co-founded the Chicago Teachers Union School Librarians Committee, as you mentioned, and I was also the Intellectual Freedom Chair for the State School Library Association. So I was working on two fronts in the realm of advocacy during that time, and it was doing that work that connected me with folks at ALA and eventually presented me with an opportunity to join the staff here.
And Megan, can I ask, did you find that being an advocate was easier than you thought?
I think that what I found was that getting started is the hardest part, and that it is, like a muscle. It's something you have to work and develop, but that the idea of advocacy is often more scary than the actual work of advocacy.
It's great. A great way to put it. Alan.
Yes, for me, it was an accident. As I mentioned, I went to Berkeley to get my PhD, and I thought I would go into management consulting. And this was in the School of Library and Information Studies. And so that was during a time when there was this unfortunate trend of trying to close library schools for budgetary reasons or whatever. And so this came to Berkeley. And at the time, I was the chair of the PhD Students Association, which means that I became the head advocate for the school to save the school. And so somehow I ended up being the, organizing, rallies and talking to the media and, coordinating with the Alumni Association and so on. And so that experience, in effect, caused me to move from the business sector or business orientation to the public policy orientation. So that was really the formative time when I shifted into public policy and advocacy and lobbying, and also became aware of the role and importance of libraries. And so that was it was an accident, but it was I guess that's the way life goes sometimes.
Well, I think the thread here from both Megan and Alan, is, along with myself, is really just getting involved and doing it. So I know that I got involved in advocacy as an assistant professor, where I was invited, Alan, to just speak out and join meetings in support of libraries in North Carolina. And so, so I think, as Megan said, in some ways, it's just getting it done, and it's a lot. Maybe easier is probably not the right word, Megan, but it is certainly not as scary once you do it, but once you start to do it. So, well, wonderful. Thank you for that. So let's shift to your thoughts about how libraries are being perceived in DC right now. So, in your sense, in your opinion, how are libraries and library support in Washington right now?
And so I would say that it's something like in between to good overall. So it's good in the sense that so libraries and the association, that we both have a golden reputation in DC and DC policy circles. It's very rare to find someone who is really against us or has a bad feeling or anything like that. And usually it's a very positive one. And that many groups, want to collaborate with us or to partner with us, whether they're other advocacy groups or even members of Congress in their offices. They actually reach out to us. So that's a really good situation and asset for libraries and for the field. We've had steady funding over the years for IMLS and the Library of Congress, for example. Which is a good thing, and especially during the Trump administration period when that they were proposing to eliminate such funding. And so, despite that, we've maintained and increased our funding. And in the current FY23 Senate Appropriations Bill, there is a proposed new $20 million for library facilities. The first time for federal funding for library facilities in decades. So there's some good progress there. And of course, during the COVID and related bills in the last 2 years or so, there's been considerable funding for libraries directly to IMLS, for example, or if that libraries are eligible, such as the Emergency Connectivity Fund. So there's been a fair bit of good things there, but there's a lot of, I think, opportunity that's still on the table too, in terms of how libraries can help advance national priorities, such as through economic opportunity and workforce evolution, both in terms of the general change in society, in terms of the digital revolution or changes from the pandemic. I think many of us are familiar with the challenges to digital access to content, and the need for better public policy there. So there are definitely things that need to be done, but that we have a good base to build on.
Great, thank you, Alan. Megan?
Well, I think that, my focus is really state and local advocacy. It's all certainly interrelated. And I would say that the tone that Alan describes of general support is evident in the conversations that local and state decision makers are having with their federal counterparts. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, and I think, Alan, in my experience, and Megan, it's not that members of Congress in particular are not supportive of libraries per se. It's just that in terms of the funding priorities, whether it makes it into their to be funded priority list, right? And I think that, that's where the real challenge is.
That's a good point. So in that sense, libraries are good. But so is funding, cancer research, and so is funding for K-12 schools, and many other, worthwhile things. And that's, of course, the challenge is that you were in effect, competing against all these other, things which are, clearly good for society. But there is a limit to how much money there is. And of course, this kind of analysis applies at the state and local levels too, right? It's like, libraries are good, but we got to fund the police department and the fire department, and we want good parks. We want to fill the potholes in the roads, right? There's all these things that we want, and so how do we make sure that we get what's appropriate for libraries?
And I was always curious about the return on investment studies. I know that, of course, they can be greeted with skepticism, but Are there really kind of seminal ROI studies that help make that case when we talk about budget and kind of where to put the money?
I wouldn't say seminal, no. I mean, there are a number of studies that suggest something like, well, they range, but maybe from $4 to $5 for every dollar invested in libraries, all the way up to even $8 per dollar return. Which are generally based on particular jurisdictions, maybe at the state level. But I think it's definitely an area where we could use more research and thinking in terms of, how to demonstrate it. It's one of those things that, we know that there's a lot of benefit to society and to communities from the activities of libraries, but we don't have as much hard data as we would like to have.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I actually have a new contact with the Department of Treasury, and they actually had asked me about a potential project. So let me follow up with you on that, because I agree. I think that if we could work together on developing a more seminal work, that might help with the overall discussion, right? So, yeah.
For sure.
And of course, what's great about having both of you is so now we have the federal perspective, but now, Megan, let's shift to the kind of the local side of things. And of course, it will vary based on state, but what is your sense about local support in communities across the nation for libraries?
Well, I think that's certainly where you're hearing the most noise right now. And it might surprise you to hear me say that overall libraries have a tremendous amount of support in their local communities and even at the state level. And polling shows that the vast majority, in the realm of 90% of voters, believe that libraries, both school and public, are important to their communities. So that is really an overwhelmingly favorable view. They also have similar opinions about library staff and believe that library staff are professional and serve their communities. I think those research findings speak to the disconnect that we're seeing in this current political moment and what people are experiencing in some communities across the country. What we see, particularly around the topic of book removal, is driven by really a national political campaign. And that some of the rhetoric around the national campaign is incredibly harmful to communities and, of course, to the librarians and educators who serve in those communities. So one of the challenges for us in this moment is how to leverage that majority that support their libraries overwhelmingly and view their librarians favorably, and how do we empower them with the tools and resources that will elevate those voices. And that is why we created the Unite Against Book Bans campaign, led by ALA, but in coalition with more than 55 national organizations. So we do have a challenge in this moment to leverage that support that we know exists. And I would say, of course, another focus for us is ensuring that we are able to support the library community through this really difficult moment professionally, and amplify voices that support those folks and help communicate what we know to be true, which is that strong libraries make strong communities.
That's fantastic, Megan. That's really good news to hear. Let me ask you kind of in terms of school libraries versus public libraries. So as you know, we are definitely leading an advocacy effort here in California, and we are also looking at it from an LS educator standpoint. But what are your thoughts about school libraries? Obviously, it depends, of course, but it just seems to me that there is a small distinction where obviously public libraries, there's a lot of support, but school libraries, in particular school libraries that are undergoing book challenges as well, that there does seem to be a difference in terms of how they're supported. Would you agree with that? Or what are your thoughts on the school library side of things?
Well, I think that the research that I just cited actually shows that people support school libraries at the same levels.
Oh, okay.
And
great.
What we were talking about just a moment ago, or what Alan and you mentioned a moment ago about funding priorities and really understanding where funding can be allocated to ensure that we have strong school libraries is the important question. And we've seen that challenge sort of evolve over time, I would say, beginning with the No Child Left Behind Act and the shift in focus to testing and preparing, to high stakes testing and ensuring that everything that is tested was invested in, and therefore school libraries actually took a hit because, of course, we don't have a school library standardized test that students had to perform on. So since that time, there has been a shifting of funding priorities. I think that people now are looking a little more holistically at what students need, and certainly with the growing understanding that this fire hose of information coming at people of all ages from all sorts of sources needs prepared young people who have strong information literacy skills. I think that there is, a beginning of realization that, oh, well, we had these people who did that. And in many cases, who continue to do that work and who are the experts in their school buildings, in their school districts, in their communities on helping young people understand how to not only navigate through information that other people are creating, but also how to be ethical and capable creators of their own information. And that shift in understanding is way too slow for my preference, but I think that we are seeing that, and people are beginning to realize that that school librarian is as important as some of the high stakes tested subject areas are.
No, that's fantastic. I think that's really an excellent point. And I have to say that whenever I ask parents about the value of school libraries, you're absolutely right. They are very strong, supportive. And then the next sentence will be, I had no idea that our school library is so poorly supported. In other words, there's an assumption there, I think, as you just said, Megan, that it's part of the educational quality infrastructure, right? And so yeah, there seems to be an educational opportunity here in terms of maybe a disjointed perspective in terms of parents valuing libraries, but maybe because of like you said, the funding priorities, their school libraries may not be as supported as they think. So
I might just say one thing about the question of school libraries and academic libraries and public libraries, and that there is I think a special responsibility for us library advocates, because if you're an elected official or an official, that the most obvious kind of library is the public library, the community library. But we in the library community, we fully understand the value of school libraries, academic libraries, and public libraries, and there is a interrelationship there in terms of that that we need all of them to work and work well together, and so that we library advocates need to invest more effort on school libraries and academic libraries, because they lack less of the natural visibility, if you will, that public libraries have.
Yeah, that's a great point, Alan. I completely agree.
And I would add to that when, particularly around legislative advocacy, when folks go to talk to their lawmakers and they hear the word library, it is just library. They don't necessarily make that distinction. And so it is important to speak with a unified voice, and where possible to do some goal setting together, some outreach together. As you both know, ALA has an ecosystem initiative that really strives to provide resources and also facilitate stronger relationships among different library types so that work is happening.
That's fantastic. Wonderful. So the next question is for those that are probably watching this. So a current student, library student, or a current librarian who's wondering, how do I get started with library advocacy? So what would your advice be to them?
Well, I think there are many different directions that library advocacy work can take. So I would say first consider what are the fundamentals, right? At its core, library advocacy is about building a climate of support for libraries of all types so that they have the resources they need to continue serving their communities, to provide opportunities for the people that they serve. So what are those fundamentals? Understanding and connecting with the community, building relationships based on trust and professional expertise, understanding and influencing power dynamics, communicating effectively, and setting goals and objectives. And it sounds like a lot, and it actually is a lot. And, I think I want to stress that advocacy is a team sport. This is not a solo act. So for those who are interested in getting started, I highly recommend joining your professional associations, join ALA, join your state association, and then begin to build your professional network from there. And that will allow you to see the bigger picture and then start to develop your own advocacy goals.
Excellent. Alan?
Yeah, well, Megan said it quite well. I would just maybe add one or two things. So one is that I think library advocacy at some level is really just part of being in the profession. So think about the spectrum, so that there, on the one hand, there's helping individuals in a library, right? That a library worker would do. There's like system level things like I curate collections in my library, or I'm responsible for the website or social media or digital programming or what have you. And then there's developing public policy, which is at the other end of the spectrum in terms of trying to get funding, for example, to libraries nationally, or at the state level, or at the local level, right? So it's just kind of a natural part of the spectrum of library work, if you will. So it's not like a special thing that, I do library advocacy because it's a special thing. It's really just part of your job, and it's part of the profession. It's a professional responsibility. The other thing is just to start learning about it. That's a good place to start. And we have some resources on our website, ala.org/advocacy. Obviously, there are other places to get information. But really, it's just to start learning. And as Megan says, start talking to people, start connecting, networking, just find out who's doing what's going on, where can I help, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's all really great advice. And I wanted to add that my suggestion to everyone interested in this is also just to get involved. I think that ultimately, when I think about my own trajectory, it was just going to meetings when called upon. We had, of course, very seasoned library advocates that basically I allowed them to kind of drive the ship, right? And I was just there to support their efforts. And that's, I think, also something for everyone to consider is that you don't have to necessarily be an expert on any particular policy or be very good at any of this. Rather, just get started, support initiatives, advocacy, events. And the good news is that once you do that, the issues and the fundamentals, as Megan said, become more natural through repetition. So I would say that's the other thing, is just get involved and follow the existing leaders. And then I think you'll find very quickly you may end up being a leader in your own right. So I really appreciate that. So let's talk about library advocacy trends in general. So I think what are kind of the, in your opinion, both, I guess, federally and then statewide, what are some of the advocacy trends that you're seeing? And that could be either issues or ways of advocating that you've seen that are particularly interesting. But if you just had to identify a few, what would you say are just kind of the trends in library advocacy right now?
I would say, first that libraries are reflective of their communities and the priorities of those communities. And so the trends too reflect what we're seeing in larger society. So certainly increased use of digital tools and communications. And that's both in the delivery of library services as well as in advocacy. So we see a huge uptick in the use of ebooks, for example. We're also seeing increased attention paid to social media by lawmakers. We're seeing the use of virtual spaces for meetings, for hearings, for town halls. I think there are some concerning trends related to digital tools as well. And the biggest one, in my view, is the proliferation of mis and disinformation. I referenced that a little while ago when we were talking about school libraries. I think that all libraries, of course, as trusted sources of accurate information, also of digital equity, are implicated in this current trend. It also has implications for our advocacy work as we confront disinformation about the library profession specifically. I think there are also community priorities that are very influenced by the pandemic. There's a clear yearning right now for human connection, post-pandemic, or whatever you're calling this moment. Post-pandemic might be strong, but that need to have the library available as a third space for people to reconnect. We're certainly seeing, of course, the issue of digital equity and libraries, not just as providers of internet access, but as important community resources for education, for connection, for use, help in understanding how to meaningfully use the tools that are available to people. We're also seeing something that's cyclical, but is certainly a big issue right now, and that's workforce development. And as we as a society consider what the future of work looks like, we're also looking at what workers need, both in terms of upskilling for future work, but also immediately in reconnecting with work opportunities that may have been lost during pandemic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Megan. Alan.
Yeah, well, that was quite good, Megan. I would just say a few things about advocacy trends specifically. So one is I think a permanent change to a hybrid environment. And so, before the pandemic, we viewed advocacy as primarily an in-person thing, supplemented by some phone calls and emails and things. And then, of course, during the pandemic, it was really becoming almost purely virtual experience. And then now it's kind of in between. But I think the steady state is going to be hybrid. And so how do you advocate effectively in that kind of environment? Also this is an obvious observation, but that, we're in such a polarized environment and there's really no sign that's changing anytime soon. And so how do we deal with that in terms of our advocacy? Because it's we're not advocating for one side or the other. We're advocating for libraries and library interests and for our communities. And so, in that sense, it's not partisan, but how do you do that in such a partisan environment, right? That's a challenge. I think it's I think the last thing I'll mention is the kind of long-term orientation in terms of so decades ago, we might talk more about the inside of the buildings. Like we have so many volumes in our collection and we have, this sort of thing. And, I hope that not too many advocates are doing that anymore and talking more about the services and the outcomes in terms of, helping people find jobs, helping them, find information for self-improvement or to apply for government programs or whatever it is, right? And so I think that continued framing will just be increasing in terms of the outward orientation.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Again, it's wonderful that all of this will be transcribed. So really great words of wisdom. What are some of the highest ALA priorities right now? So kind of now into the next couple of years, what are the biggest priorities for ALA?
Well, I guess I'll start and then Megan can add on to it. It's kind of a problem to answer the question because priorities implies distill it down to what's most important. And then I can give you a list of 30 things.
Yeah,
right. It's like, well, no, that's not useful because 30 priorities doesn't make much sense. But I think Megan already mentioned the Unite Against Book Bans. And so that whole censorship, stream of issue is just so problematic that's obviously very high on our priority agenda. So next year is going to be a new Congress. And so, and there'll be a lot of new members and a possible change in control too. And so we'll be, focusing a lot on that in terms of getting to know the offices and the people and making sure that they understand the value of libraries and, and that sort of thing. So that's really important. There are a couple of issues which, appropriations is a perennial. Every year we have to worry about trying to, maximize federal appropriations for libraries. So that's clearly remains a priority. I think another additional priority this year, at least at the federal level, is looking at library champions, because we're losing a few of our top leaders in Congress because of retirement, or in fact, tragically, because they lost their primaries, 2 of them in the state of Michigan even. And so we're looking at how we can develop some of the library-friendly members of Congress into becoming, champions. And so that's an important priority for the coming year.
Great. Thank you, Alan. Megan?
So at the state and local level, I would say a lot of our work sort of echoes what Alan just mentioned and really building relationships in the climate of support for libraries of all types. There are certainly clear issues that impact libraries across the country, like funding, both resources and operations, professionally staffed school libraries, patron privacy, the right to access information. What that translates to in terms of legislation or local policy varies widely. And ALA does not set state legislative agendas. Those are set by our state partners. So ALA supports that work and supports our members and our partner state associations. So as Alan said, there are some things that are sort of big that we know will be priorities across the country. Some of them I mentioned, and certainly, circling back to that issue of censorship and ensuring that we are able to shift the narrative and work through the United Against Book Bans campaign and our coalition of partners across the country will be an important priority for us. And then, of course, providing the resources to our states so that they have what they need will be another priority for us.
Excellent. I wanted to follow up with, in my experience, there is at times a disconnect between, as Megan, you had said, the support of the community and maybe how the decision makers are viewing it. And this is kind of, I'm thinking at the city and county level in particular. What are your thoughts, but really for both of you, in terms of the decision makers? And of course, it depends on the community, but in general, is there still that disconnect in your opinion? And I say that in terms of oftentimes the decision makers may come from a different social economic background and have a specific view on what everybody else has in terms of access to information and books and et cetera.
I think that's a great point, Anthony. I also think that there is sometimes a disconnect in terms of what is real. So very many decision makers are unaware of how their libraries are funded and how reliant they are on local funding sources. So it's really important for library advocates to have those conversations and explain or educate their elected officials about how that library funding works and then how it is aligned to the priorities of the community. But the disconnect, I think, is certainly not just with local decision makers when we talk about the perceptions of what is needed, but also in terms of the folks who influence them. So it's important not just to stop with the decision makers, but engage in communities in that in those conversations as well, and engage community leaders so that people really do have an understanding both of library funding models, but also what the impact of that funding is.
Megan, honestly, I don't think I've ever seen in all of my work a library holding an advocacy day for the patrons. I think that's really a fantastic idea. Really not for the patrons, but really for the community. I think it's always been so focused on the decision makers. That's a really interesting point. So yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah,
I do think perhaps not explicitly dedicated to advocacy, but libraries do convene community leaders. Mm-hmm. I think about the Columbus Public Library that convened a broadband group during the pandemic to step up the services offered and coordinated by many different city agencies. So bringing in school folks, bringing in business folks, bringing in people from the mayor's office, bringing in people from other departments, and convening a conversation on a particular topic, and in that case, broadband. I think that also helps convey the way the library funding is necessary as a part of this larger this larger operation, in the case of the project in Columbus, to really serve the residents of Columbus with very timely and pressing needs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point, and I think libraries are doing, like you said, doing that across the country. I guess what I was saying though is maybe there needs to be less humility and more like a library celebration day, right? Where because I do think too that patrons and all customers of systems, they use the system for only a few specific things, right? And so they oftentimes don't think about or don't know all of the other types of people that are being served. So yeah, I think yeah, I mean maybe we need to have a library celebration day where there's almost an explicit Alan, a return on investment focus, right? Which is that, we're celebrating the library, and just so you know, here are all the things that we do for all different walks of life in our community. So, but Alan, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I love celebrations, and so I'm looking for my invitation. So, I think Megan said it all.
we do have National Library Week and School Library Month, and those are certainly moments that some of those messages can be elevated. But I often tell people, if your elected officials cannot picture an individual, a person, when they think about your library and they think about workforce development, or when they think about early literacy, if they're not conjuring images of their own constituents and the benefits to their constituents, then we're not doing a good enough job in telling the library story. We really need to do a good job in making those things very tangible and helping draw a picture of what that looks like. All year round too, not just on those celebration days.
Yeah. No, I think that's excellent. So let me skip around since we're running against our time together. So let's talk about different levels of library advocacy. So kind of at the local, state, national, and I'm a librarian that's motivated by this wonderful talk and want to get involved. So maybe just describe kind of the different levels and maybe how one would get involved, especially if, say, I'm a part of a state association advocacy team. So what are the different levels of advocacy in your opinions?
Well, I think Alan mentioned something earlier that I want to circle back to, and that is that we really need to reinforce the fact that advocacy is part of our professional responsibilities. And whether library workers and library professionals like it or not, they are advocating for their libraries, and the impact of that advocacy is what we need to consider. So, that doesn't mean necessarily events, advocacy messaging, but it does mean on a daily basis considering how what the community priorities are, how the library is connected to those priorities, and how the library is communicating that connection and that service to the community priorities on a regular basis and through multiple channels. And how individual interactions also impact people's perceptions of the library. So frontline staff, of course, have the most frequent interactions with voters, for example, or with parents who bring in their young children, or with members of the Friends group. And it is important that advocacy is understood as part of the overall responsibilities of library staff across levels, across library types, and across type of work.
Yeah, that's a great
So that's
point.
one thing. I also think that, in some ways it's easier to work backwards in this case, because it's certainly a no-brainer to join your professional associations and connect to the advocacy programming and opportunities that those associations offer. So ALA has just revamped its online learning. There are all sorts of opportunities through the online learning. ALA has committees that meet in person at annual conference, where people can sit and listen in on the work of those committees, but also consider applying to join those committees. We have a volunteer process that's on that. You can see that on the ALA website, both for the Committee on Legislation, Committee on Library Advocacy, their subcommittees. I would also say there's a tremendous amount of work being done across the association through various divisions and roundtables that present opportunities to be engaged in advocacy work of various types and perhaps specifically related to a particular interest. I also think that it is helpful to take advantage of the ALA events and state association events to start building that local network, because that is where you'll meet people who have common interests, but it's also where you'll see best practices and learn about models that can be replicated at the local level. So that would be my advice in terms of starting.
Thank you, Megan. Alan?
Yeah, so first I would just say that the levels, the common levels are local, state, and national. But then I would also throw in regional within a state or regional across states. And so I think in a number of respects, there isn't really that much difference in terms of library advocacy in that, what you're trying to do is make a connection with a person, right? It's the staff before a state legislature or a member of Congress or the city council or the actual elected person or whatever official, right? You're trying to make a connection. And so you're trying to establish a relationship. You're trying to communicate some information, but it's not just an information dump. They're regular people just like you, and so you're trying to make a connection. And so that's true no matter what level you're talking about. So in that sense, it's not that different. What is different, though, is that there are different contexts. And so I work primarily at the federal level, the U.S. Congress and regulatory agencies and the executive branch. So does that make me an expert on engaging with the California state legislature? No, right? I don't know that legislature. I don't know the staffers, the political context, the media surrounding that in Sacramento, et cetera. I don't know that. And so to be careful when you start changing levels, that you have skills that transfer, but you don't necessarily know the context. And so you have to be aware of what you do know or can do and what you don't know and can't do.
Mm-hmm. Great. Excellent. So let's end with two final questions. So the second to the last question, let's go back to tactics. So I am, again, inspired and I'm an advocate. So what are some of the tactics that are really working out there? So how do I practice advocacy? What are the best practices on being a really effective advocate?
Well, I think it's really important to understand before you leap in, and I do advise, not waiting to do something, but it's important to understand both the climate in which you're operating and also what others are doing. One thing that is not effective is having dozens of advocates who are saying different things. That really clouds the message. So unified messaging is really important. And whether that's at the local level, even, within a single school district or a single county or city, it's also important that the folks who are advocating have a sense of what priorities are and, not necessarily aim for the finish line before hitting some interim milestones. Sometimes, for example, getting the huge funding increase should be preceded by steps that start to build support for that. So it's essential to understand what that climate is and what is possible, what has happened before. And, as Alan said, we can't be the experts on every single location or every single state. I think what we bring is an understanding of a process, the ability to strategize and help people understand how to do that within their own communities or within their own states. So the last thing I would say is that it is really helpful to consider how you're communicating in terms of your sort of overall presentation. This is really tricky in this highly polarized moment as we're putting messages out there. What is it that people are seeing overall? And if I am an individual advocate, and for example, I have a social media account that I post to, a dozen times a day, and one of those is an advocacy message, and the other 11 are something that don't align with the advocacy message I'm trying to get out, or if I am communicating differently in different places, I'm sort of undermining my own message. I think it's important to think about communications now because we have so many opportunities to get messages out. We really need to be intentional about what messages we are communicating, where we're communicating them, and how they align with our overall goals.
Great. Thank you, Megan. I think really in the end, so for those of you listening, definitely make sure you're aware of what your local or state associations are doing as you prepare to connect with decision makers. So, Alan, go ahead.
Yeah, just two things quickly. One is to do your homework. It's to understand if you're talking to an elected official or the staffer of an elected official, what do they care about? What are they thinking about? Because you're trying to align, what does the library need, or what do libraries need, and what do they want, or what are they planning to do, or what are they interested in? And you're trying to find the common ground, right, of things that you need that they want to do. And so there's some intersection there. And so your job is to kind of figure out what that is. I'm not sure with any kind of official who has resources of interest, like a foundation executive too, right? Same idea. And again, just that idea of that they're real people. So don't be intimidated. Almost always they start with a favorable view of libraries, right? So that puts us ahead of many other professions where that's not true necessarily. And so that, they're predisposed to like you or want to be helpful. And so, and that they're just real people doing stuff. And so just talk to them.
Wonderful. Well, due to time, we'll go ahead and conclude. I want to thank everybody for joining us, our first advocacy podcast. It's been very illuminating. And again, all of this will be transcribed and posted in the near future. So thank you very much.